Okay, so we're going to be talking, or I'm going to be talking today about how the past meets the future in a particular museum in our community, the BMA. And in some ways, the TED Talk arrangement behind me that was spoken about earlier reflects that strong connection between the past, the present, and the future. And I'd love to convince you that the same kind of experience takes place in a museum, specifically the Baltimore Museum of Art. We have incredibly great collections at the BMA, amazing works of art, 95,000 of them. Just imagine what an awesome number that is. And our collection goes from the historic to the contemporary. But I think it's important to remember about the BMA that a lot of the BMA's collection was formed and collected by people as contemporary art. So even if it's from the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the people who amassed those collections were speaking to living artists they knew and cared about. And the art that they were collecting was extremely relevant for their time and place. And I think as we look to the future, we have an opportunity in the museum to continue and build on that foundation. The history of the BMA is somewhat important to consider in how all this happened. You may not be aware, but there was a gigantic fire in Baltimore in 1904. 140 acres burned, and 1,500 buildings were destroyed. And if you imagine how big Baltimore was back then, that was a lot of the city. A very substantial decline could have occurred. Citizens around the city formed committees to talk about what the city needed to do to rebuild. And one committee recommended, let's start a museum, which is so lucky for us today that they had the foresight to recognize that a museum would make a difference in any city, but especially in a city that was focusing on a comeback. Then the museum itself was founded in 1914. It brought together people from all over the city, from some different backgrounds, brought together the Christian and the Jewish community, perhaps for the first time in this city. It also involved Hopkins. In 1924, Johns Hopkins University gave the city of Baltimore 8 acres on which to build the BMA next to the campus here. So when you start to know the numbers of people, the numbers of organizations and institutions that help make this possible, it's really pretty amazing. In 1929, we opened the first building of the museum, a magnificent neoclassical designed building that was designed by John Russell Pope, a leading architect of his generation. And he went on to do some small other projects after this. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, the Jefferson Memorial. He built additions to the Tate and the British Museum in London. But we were his first museum here in Baltimore, so it's very special. When the museum opened, it was virtually an empty building with maybe one painting or something. And today, all these things have streamed in thanks to generosity from people in our town. The collectors who made the museum great, interestingly, many of them were women. And in fact, it's interesting to note that the first director of the museum, Florence Nightingale Levy, I love that her first name was Florence Nightingale. She's going to make us whole and save us. Commuted down from New York City to be the first director. And there were also important women collectors here in Baltimore. I'm sure you're all aware of Claribel and Etta, who are our best known collectors and who forged for the BMA the largest collection of Matisse's work in the world. If you can imagine, that's right here, a stone's throw from this room. They were amazing women. In this slide, you see them seated outdoors with Gertrude Stein, another famous collector who has an association with Baltimore. Claribel studied medicine here in Baltimore at the Women's Medical School here in her time, and did some postgraduate work also at Hopkins. And so you get this wonderful group of women who really are intellectuals, activists, and they have fabulous taste. I'd like to think that somewhere in Baltimore today, someone has picked the two most important artists of our generation, of our time, to collect. I mean, imagine that the Cohn sisters collected Matisse and Picasso. What are the odds of someone choosing artists of that magnitude and transformation for the 20th century? So we have to hope that it's going to happen again. Here you see also their home, the famous Blue Nude by Matisse in the lower slide in the distance. And then you see Matisse himself standing in the Cohn's apartment in 1929. He came here on his way to Pittsburgh to judge the Carnegie International and stopped here in Baltimore to visit Claribel and Etta in their home down on Utah Place. And I always say, I think he really came to check out the new building at the BMA because he wanted to see if it was good enough to hang his art in. And in fact, this kind of sense of, can this small museum in this town, this new museum, prove itself, is sort of a part of the story. So, for example, Claribel Cohn in her will said to Etta, who survived her, the BMA should get their collection of modern art, but only if we showed appreciation for modern art, sufficient appreciation. We had to prove ourselves. Another of our donors, Saidie Adler May, an amazing person. She herself was a distant cousin of the Cohns. She painted. She started our children's center, an amazingly foresightful thing in the 1940s, where children were educated through art experiences in the museum. She established our members' room and curated it. And in fact, a lot of the work she put there was too adventuresome for the museum. She was ahead of us in certain ways. For example, she decided to exhibit Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles in that room, and we declined to acquire it. I think it's important to remember that whether art is in our own community or art comes nationally or internationally, it needs to be important to contemporary life. So I'm showing here a slide. On one side, a beautiful, on your left, a beautiful wall piece by Jimmy Joe Roach, who teaches here in the Film and Media Studies program. We did a one-man show for him at the museum. And on the other side, a beautiful sculpture by Nick Cave. Nick Cave's a fantastic African-American artist who works in Chicago. And we're so thrilled to have this sound suit with so much intricate, beautiful detail in it. I really urge you to come and see it in person. Interestingly, these two works are a little bit connected, oddly. Jimmy Joe Roach is a member of the Wham City Collective, and a young lady, April Camlin, who was a studio assistant with Nick Cave recently, is a member of the same collective here in Baltimore. And I think that shows how connected everything is, from the local scene to the national to the international. I'd also point out that the BMA took a leadership role in, and I think it's really impressive, in the exhibition of African American art. The first major traveling exhibition of African American art in this country was in 1942. And the BMA, which essentially is in the south of the Mason-Dixon line, showed this exhibition, and I think that was a really important statement about our commitment to the African American community here in Baltimore. I think it's important to remember about Baltimore that there are fabulous, glamorous areas of Baltimore, like the Inner Harbor, which was really came back and was developed in the 1970s, where we have, Harbor East and the Four Seasons Hotel and all sorts of development going on, restaurants. It's very chic. But in other places in Baltimore, there are still neighborhoods where there are boarded up houses, where there are social issues and challenges. And, how do we make these different parts of Baltimore a whole? And how can everyone in the city find in the museum and become engaged with art that will change their lives and make them aware of the kind of social values that we want people to value? The BMA has also made an enormous commitment to free admission. We did that with our colleague institution, the Walters, in 2006. But free admission is not enough. We have to do more to reach out to people. For the BMA to become a community anchor and to be really valued and important in this community, we need to be a place where people come. We need to connect with people all over the city and in so many different ways. And beyond the city, of course, as well. And today we have so many more ways of doing that than we did 5, 10, 15 years ago. Some of the outreach that we do is actual physical outreach. On one side, you see the BMA Outpost, which is a wonderful effort that sends an artist to communities for month-long residences in all different parts of the city, east side, west side, north and south. And the artist who runs the program brings along reproductions of things in the museum, art-making materials, refreshments, becomes a focal point within a community. And we hope that will make people feel comfortable to take advantage of free admission and to come to the museum. I'd also mention a recent initiative called Share the Love, where we asked people on social media to come to the museum and to put a heart next to the work of art that they found most beloved to them, most engaging and important to them. And we had literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people come to do this. And I will say some people couldn't make up their mind, so they cut their heart in half and put half of their heart in each place. I don't blame them. If I did it, I'd probably have to cut my heart into 300 pieces. I love so many things at the BMA. I think it's also important to remember that the BMA is part of an art ecosystem all over the city. There are other organizations, large and small, some of them DIY, sort of underground spaces, where artists are working to connect with the community to make this a more interesting, engaging place. And the Maryland Institute College of Art, as a leading art school, has played a very big role in this revitalization. And I'm mentioning on this slide 2 ways to find out about what's going on, going on in Baltimore any day of the week. Culture Fly, which is put out by the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, can tell you what's up every day in case you're bored or you don't have any studying to do or whatever. And Showspace is a sort of more youthfully focused, shall we say, mostly music scene site. We were very happy in this renovation that was mentioned in the introduction to be able to transform the museum in certain ways that make the museum more welcoming to people when they come. So, for example, here you see the reopening of the Merrick entrance, the historic entrance of the museum. So now, after 30 years of it being closed, people can go right up the front steps into the heart of the museum and have that experience of running up the steps, sort of like in the Rocky movie. That's what I think of every time I run up the steps. So we've renovated the Fox Court of the museum, which is the sort of columned court in the center, and made it a lively place. We respected all of its historic details, put back its historic chandeliers, but meanwhile, we've been doing things like putting Wi-Fi in so that you can, communicate with your devices through our thick limestone walls. But you can see here also a desk in the distance made to greet people, welcoming them when they come in. We did the same thing on the east side of the museum, which I know you will think of as the side of the museum near Gertrude's Restaurant. But what we did is we knocked down the stairway that had been built in 1982 and moved it, working with Ziegler Sneed Architects, around the curved wall in the lobby and opened the space up so much more, installed a welcome desk for people. Now we have visitor service associates who will step right up and ask you, what do you want to see? Can I make a recommendation? Do you need a map? Thank you for coming to the BMA. All that said, art remains at the very heart of all that we do. And an example of this is an exhibition we did in 2009 about Matisse, such an important part of our collection. And in this, we examined his work in sculpture. And we tried to recreate, as you see in the slide, the sense of a sculpture being worked on in an artist's studio. It's almost as if those stands, were taken right out of Matisse's own individual studio. But we also used technology. We brought that to bear, investigating the ways in which each cast by Matisse of each of his sculptures is unique. The cone wing, which was renovated in 2001, the first project that we undertook when I became director. And you can see how it looked in 1986 on the left. And I think that you can see it's very different than how it looks now. The sculptures were contained in glass cases, almost like specimen. You really couldn't get too close to them and experience them, and they were isolated from the paintings. So we made an effort to integrate all different aspects of Matisse's work. Because we have such an astounding collection of his things, we're able to tell a wonderful story about how and why each work of art was made. And I think if you look along the bottom slides, you'll see the wonderful Degas little dancer, who in the 1986 installation is back against the window, sort of like, don't get too close to her. But now we've moved her to the center of things so that there she is, beautiful. You can be around her. You see children on a school tour, or a little girl with a costume pack dressing up like the little dancer. We've also tried to make the museum more open. It's sort of a metaphor for access. Previously, it was difficult to see from the cone wing into the contemporary wing. Now in this slide, you see the beautiful wooden trim of the cone wing, and in the distance, the Henry Moore sculpture that welcomes you to the contemporary wing. We have all that open. We've taken down big, heavy glass doors with dark film on it, so you can see from one place to another. And we commissioned Sarah Oppenheimer, a fabulous artist whose work appears on the right, to create penetrations in the walls between the cone wing and the contemporary wing. So while you're walking around the cone wing, you catch glimpses of what might lie ahead if you move forward. And again, this is the contemporary wing, comparing it when it was built in 1994 on the left to the way it looks today. And continuing this theme of openness, if you look on the left, you see that big, tall, white column. Our curator had the idea, well, what if we just took that out? Well, of course, those of you who are engineers in the room know what would happen if we just took it out. The building would fall down. But fortunately, we consulted with engineers and put in a transit beam. And now you can see all across the contemporary wing, and you're lured to go from one place to another. You see on the left an Andy Warhol, and directly down the center, this fantastic Olafur Eliasson sculpture. Experiential works of art fill the contemporary wing. On the left, you see a sculpture by Franz West that we allow you to sit on, and this is a big favorite with people because, in museums very often there are rules about touching things, and most of our things are not meant to be touched. But we want to make some opportunities for people to engage and sort of feel like participants in the museum, not just as spectators. On the right, you see a wonderful piece by Felix Gonzalez Torres, a beaded curtain that you slip through to go from one room to another. That piece also reflected his experience in being treated for AIDS. We have new experiences, a mobile tour, the big table, a room where you can sit and make art, where you can sit down and relax with friends, taking pauses, being human within the museum, encouraging conversation, dialogue, and exchange. We've also renovated the American wing. On the left, you see how this area of the building looked before. We had two beautiful Louis Comfort Tiffany columns on either side of our beautiful fan window. But now we've created a more immersive experience and inserted a great Tiffany window between them so that people actually are drawn in from a long view towards this. We've also broken the chronology, juxtaposing early 1800s Baltimore Federal desk with Aigle-Musée painted panels. That means reverse painted on glass. Imagine conceiving a painting in reverse from the first thing on the surface to the last and painting it on glass. On the right, you see a work by Rebecca Salisbury James, who is a modernist, the wife of Paul Strand, executed in the same manner. Here we go, we've sort of traveled from art history to storytelling. Here you see a Walter Ufer painting, and in the background, a wedding jar from the Santa Clara Pueblo. Our curator was able to acquire one of these wedding jars where the husband and wife each drink from one side of it. Our curator was able to get one by Margaret Tafara, who is the daughter of the lady who made the one that's in the painting. This is all about storytelling. If you look here, you can see we go from the way the American wing used to look to the way it looks today. Today we're emphasizing historic details, chair rails, colors, wooden floors, and we're integrating fine and decorative arts together because that's a richer story about art than just one medium alone. Additionally, we have been able to go in the American wing from local to global. So in the slide on the left, you see the history of American art in its international nature and the ways in which it engages with art around the world. On the right, you see an entire side of the American wing dedicated to Maryland. What makes this city unique? We have such amazing craftspeople in the history and the present moment here in Baltimore. So thank you for listening to me, and come soon to the museum.